Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ken Rudin, and I am the Director of Growth Lab. And I wanted to talk a bit today about three different areas. First one is the OKR that we've heard about. We've talked about how it benefits, but there's actually data behind that thanks to the Magic Eye team, and I just wanted to share a little bit on that to show you, in fact, how sharing across the ecosystem can benefit each of us individually as products. The second thing I want to talk about is the growth process itself. And then the last thing that we'll cover is what does Growth Lab actually do and how can it help with the various teams in this room and across the company. So the first part, we heard about this, both Noam and Paul spoke about that, but what I really want to do is share two slides that I think are pretty compelling in terms of where this came from. This did not come from just somebody deciding we should actually get companies and products within our company to work with each other, and let's randomly pick 4 as a number of products that we want to have each user use. There was some real good analysis behind this, and some of the things that we found were this. Now this is correlation, but it's pretty strong correlation, and what it shows you is not only do we get better engagement in the ecosystem when products share users and we can install one product from another. Not only does that help increase the engagement with the Google ecosystem, it increases the engagement of each individual product. And it also decreases the overall churn. So this slide is looking at the churn, and you can see that for any one of these, like YouTube, if you've got a single product, you've got somewhere in the order of 20, 25, whatever that number is, but as you get more and more products, the churn rate for YouTube goes down. As a user uses more and more products, what we're seeing is it's correlated with reduced churn overall. Now again, I said it's correlated, and we haven't yet proven it's causal, but there's really good hypotheses that it should be causal. Just take as an example. Yeah, question? Okay.
How do you define churn?
Oh, how do we define churn? Well, that'll be a question for Diane and the Magic Eye team. But usually, what's that?
Go core metrics.
Go core metrics, right? But it's not actively using the product, and it's a standard one within 28 days. But one of the things that the Magic Eye team has done is try and standardize so we can have discussions like this about what does engagement mean and what does churn mean. So you can see across these that it reduces as you get more users. And the example that I wanted to give was something like if you have, let's say you're using Chrome and only Chrome, and then suddenly you start using Gmail as well. Every time you click on a link in Gmail, it can now drive you back to Chrome, so it will increase your engagement. And because the products can direct users between and across products, that's why it can reduce churn. And here's a slide as well that shows what happens to engagement. The lines on the bottom are the engagement levels in terms of the number of days within a period of 28 days, known as the L28 metric. The number of days that you're using the product in that 4-week period. And you can see as you're using more products, the number of days you use each individual product goes up as well. So this is the core data behind the metric. And the foundation here is that by helping the ecosystem, you're helping yourself. And the number 4, by the way, I don't have that chart here, but there's also a knee in the curve. That for example, engagement increases and churn decreases pretty significantly, but then once you're at 4 or 5, it starts to asymptote a bit. So 4 is where we want to get people because that's the knee in the curve, and we get better engagement and better churn rates, lower churn rates when we do that. Talking about growth, so this is one of the things we want to do. We want to grow the ecosystem, we want to grow our products, but how do we do that? Historically, in companies I've been in previously, growth as a process didn't really exist. It was well, if there was a process, it was let's figure out the types of things we want to do for the product, the features generally, and we put them on whiteboards. Actually, we put them on Post-it notes, and then we put those on whiteboards so we can move them around. And then what do people normally do? Have you guys been part of this? What do you normally do? You've got them all up on a whiteboard, on little post-it notes, and how do you then prioritize based on that? Ambush, okay, pretty close. Any other suggestions? I think ambush is a pretty good one. But you vote. Everybody sits there and says, I think these three are the ones that we should be working on, and you put little tick marks next to them. And I think we've all seen that process either here or at other companies many, many times. Ultimately, what you're basing that on is, and somebody will mention it a little later, it's whoever can talk the loudest in the room gets their way. And it's referred to as a HIPPO a little later, and you'll find out what HIPPO stands for. But basically, that is a process that is totally gut instinct based. Growth is not a set of tricks or a set of techniques that you need to learn. It's not about finding the killer feature or the silver bullet. It is a data-driven, iterative process that you can repeat again and again to make sure that you will get growth. And I guarantee if you follow this process, you will get growth. You may get a little, you may get a lot, but you will get growth. I've never seen this process not work at least a little bit. And this is the foundation of the process. There's a lot in each of these areas, but fundamentally it comes down to these three steps where it's an understand, identify, experiment. The first phase, and we're working with several groups in this room already, and others are doing it on their own, which is also great. There's really four things you need to do in the first phase. The first one is to analyze the data you've got. And you're looking at things like, where are the users coming from? What channels predominantly are they coming from? How successful are we in the onboarding rate? What are the engagement and retention levels sliced by different cohorts? What are the features that people are using that are most correlated with engagement? And please don't use averages. Show distributions and histograms. That's where you really see what's going on. So that's one of the first things you need to do. Then with some of that as a foundation, you figure out your North Star metric. And this is your core metric. It goes by lots of different names, but this is the one metric. And there's one example in Google where they've actually used two, which is YouTube, but that's okay. It's your one or maybe two metrics that is everything you are driving towards. It tends not to change that frequently either in terms of this. You don't change your North Star metric every quarter. You change the target values for it, but it's something that takes a fair bit of discussion and debates, and the goal isn't to get perfect in terms of getting something that captures absolutely everything you want it to, but the goal is to get down to one metric so that you can focus and you can measure all the work you're doing against that metric. It's a hard thing to do to get everyone to agree on it, but the power of getting everyone to focus on just one particular metric is an unbelievable in terms of how it gets everyone to focus. So once you've got your North Star metric, the other thing that you get, and this really comes out of the analysis, are your magic moments. These are your aha moments. These are the things that you want to get users to as quickly as possible. I don't know if all of you know what those are yet. If you do, great. If not, one of the first things you should do is figure out what those things are. What are the things that are most highly correlated, those actions, those activities, those experiences that are most highly correlated with engaged users, because that's what you want your onboarding process to focus on. You need to know what it is where someone says, I get it, I understand what this is, it's either an enjoyable experience or this is something that really shows me how this is different. That's what you need to get them to. The onboarding process is not a one-time first-run experience. You're not done onboarding a user or activating a user until you feel that they are in an engaged state. That can take many iterations, and it can take many weeks to get there. You need to know at what point do you consider them to be engaged, and that's what you have to get them to. And that's, again, what the magic moment is. Then there's two other things, which are tools that are becoming really common in some high-tech companies now. We started using them here to great effect, which are user flows and growth models. Now, when I started doing growth about 8 years ago, we didn't have these, and I wish we did. I'll go into more detail in the next two slides about what they are, but user flows are a visual way of mapping out how a user goes through your product. There's the traditional funnel of where a user starts and where a user ends, but the problem with that is it has this notion of a start and an end. And it's a linear kind of unidirectional funnel where you start at the top and you go down to the bottom. That's just not true. That's not how users go through your product. They loop through things many, many times. They go through multiple phases many times. So a user flow is a way to capture that, and it also gives you then an analytic way of describing it and analyzing it and identifying growth opportunities. And then a growth model is a very different tool. This one, instead of being a visual representation of your product, this one is a quantitative representation of your product. What this is for is figuring out what are the levers you have for growth. Now, both of these are different tools, but really valuable in terms of understanding where to focus growth. They both give you a vocabulary to talk about consistently, and they give you a data-driven way to get rid of the Post-it notes on a whiteboard. You now have a data-driven way to say, this is why we're doing this feature this quarter, other than somebody who could speak very loudly in the room saying, I think that's the right way to go. From there, you go on to the identify phase, where what you're doing there is using that data, using those models to figure out where you should focus, again, in a very quantitative way. This is why it's a process that can be repeated and will work, because it's based not on gut instinct, it's based on actual results, and you can optimize results. So you're looking for here, if you want to start, there's generally 2 or 3 things to look at in the identify phase. First is you want to look for underused sticky features. So these are the features you identified previously that drive a lot of engagement. There are always going to be some in your product that are driving a lot of engagement, but far fewer people than you think are using them than you should be using them. So for example, when I was in the search org, one of the things that we found there was that people who search for sports scores, very sticky, because they change all the time, so there's reason to come back all the time. Drives a lot of engagement. But when we asked people, about 70% of people did not even know we had sports scores that were available in Google search. So just by raising awareness of something like that, you can drive growth. So that's identifying an underused, very sticky feature. A second thing you can look at is in user flows, and I was just talking about what those are. As users go from state to state in these user flows, there's always a percentage of people who make it from state 1 to state 2. And it's never 100%. And you'll find as you have a flow, multiple stages, if you're asking someone to enter a credit card, if you want to upload photos to a photo album, whatever it is, multiple stages, there's always going to be, if you start at 100%, we all know you never end at 100%. But somewhere in the middle, almost always, one of those stages is going to be far worse than the others. You're going to see a big drop off in one of those stages. The user flows will help you identify which stage that is, so you can focus on that. That's the second thing you can look at for identify. And the third one is when you're slicing, and I said don't use averages, use distributions and histograms, you can always find anomalies and outliers. And those are usually really good opportunities for growth. Either it's a low-end anomaly, meaning something is broken, and just by fixing it, quick fix, you can get better growth. Or you've uncovered an opportunity that's working really well in one part of the world. You're not using it elsewhere. So it shows you that, hey, maybe we can start rolling this out elsewhere too. And then you can prioritize all of these opportunities again using these models. And then you go into the last phase, which is experiment, where you come up with a hypothesis, identify these things. What are the ways that I think I can change the product so that I can take advantage of these things I've identified? And then you run these experiments. And this is where the game of inches notion comes in, and a lot of people refer to growth as a game of inches. It's not about building huge new features. Almost always, the majority of growth that you'll see comes from lots and lots and lots of little experiments that you'll be running. So just drilling into 2 parts of that, the parts that are probably newer to most people in the room, the user flow. So there is some notion, a little bit of a funnel if you're going left to right here. But what this is showing is a very simple way for, in this case, a hypothetical product, but real products that we have that we've done this for, and I think you may see some today, aren't that much more complicated than this. The notion is keep it simple enough so that you can draw it from memory. But this shows where are the main sources of downloads coming from. And then from downloads, they're going through this activation process. And then from there, they're becoming an engaged user. We figure out what in the activation process they need to do to become engaged. And then from there, there's a couple things that they can do that are important. They can generate an event that will generate a notification, which then they can receive and brings them back in. So that's something that we call an engagement loop or retention loop. You really want to be looking for things like this. Another thing they can do is send out a viral invite, if your app has those things. And that creates another loop. That's an acquisition loop, which is really, really powerful. Each one of these arrows, you can put a number on as well, which is the percentage of people who use that arrow. So it can be the percentage of people who go from one box to the next, or all the way on the left, the percentage of people that are coming from each of those 4 boxes. This is where you start looking at those flows and identifying, gee, one of those I've got like 12% make it across that arrow. I need to figure out why it's so low. So you can identify and point to it and say, this is why we're working on this part of the product. This is where a problem exists or an opportunity exists, and that's how we're going to drive growth. The other part, and this is in the handout, so you don't have to worry about reading it here, but this is a growth model, and there tends to be 2 parts to it. The first thing you do is create the left part, which is an outline of it. And it really starts with, what is my North Star metric? Consider that the output of some function that we're going to build. What are the inputs? If the output, as an example, let's say daily active users is a fairly common one. If the output is daily active users, well, what drives that? There's all kinds of ways to slice this. There's no right or wrong way, but a common way of doing it is, well, daily active users is a combination of new users and retained users. Okay, let's drill into that. Where do new users come from? Where do retained users come from? And so, for example, here, again, don't worry about reading it, but it says new users are coming from things like, well, it's the number of people we're getting to the App Store from viral invitations, and the number that we're getting from cross promos, things like when you're using GrowthKit, and the number we're getting from ads, and the number we're getting from marketing. It's that sum multiplied by the percentage of people that are actually clicking on download, multiplied by the percentage of people who, after downloading, successfully become activated and engaged. That's where new users comes from. So now each of those I can drill down further. I've got the number of people who are being brought to the App Store through viral invitations. Well, what's that a function of? It's a function of how many users I have times the percentage of them that send a notification times the number of notifications they send. And you may want to go down 1 or 2 more levels. The notion here is the power of this is it shows me how all the levers fit together, but it also enables me to do one very important thing which all growth teams seem to struggle with, which is I can run this experiment, and let's say daily active users is my overall North Star metric. I can run this experiment, and it seems like it did something good based on the metrics I was trying to move, but I didn't see any movement in daily active users. Usually because the effect is a little too small and there's so many other things going on, you can't quite catch the signal in all the other noise.